Tonight, my name is Elsa Fisher, and I'm the president of the board. I'm honored to be president of the board of directors. Just for a treat, would the board of directors raise their hand if anybody's on the board? Helen Lemoyne, Ronnie Cronin. It's Ronnie Cronin. They're here tonight, and others may be coming. We're very excited about this year. Our fearless leader, Annie, is taking us to great places along with her program committee, which is incredible. And Ronnie is also on the program committee with Ed Convery and Mary Murphy and Pat. Yes. So they've done a great job, and we just love some of the programs they've had. When you get right down to it, history are stories, and history are words. And one of the words that has always held an interest to me is the word Framingham. And we always heard there used to be an L in it. And I never saw an L in it as long as I've lived here. So we're going to find out tonight what's happened with that L and learn a little bit about our sister city in England. So I welcome all of you. Enjoy the evening, and we hope to see you again real often. Bye-bye. Our director, and it's a pleasure to work with you. Thank you. I guess we have to start getting RSVPs on these invitations. I'm sorry if you're standing. There is a seat up here. I think we can fit somebody in here. There's another seat
there's a
up
chair
here.
over there.
So come on up. Don't be bashful.
There's one over there.
And we've got a chair over there, I think, as well. I think we might have to start doing some programs at the Village Hall, which I don't know if you've noticed, but it's got a new coat of paint on it. We're Historical Society, and we really just decided that in order to be able to rent the space, we had to have it be a rentable space, and it was looking pretty doggy, and now I think it's looking beautiful again. So we're very excited about that, and if you ever want to look at the inside, it's an amazing building. We need to rent it to keep it going, so think about it in the future. So welcome to Framlingham, excuse me. It's amazing how these programs come to fruition. This one began in February when we learned that Terry Gilder of Framingham would be visiting us in October, and we would like to have Woody like to come and speak, and of course we would like to have him come speak. One thing led to another, and it's our honor to have Terry here, and he is going to speak a lot about the past links between Framingham and Framingham. And I really think it's important to him that we refresh this link, and we remember our link to Framingham, and they to us as well, and you'll hear more about that. Terry is on holiday with his wife Beryl, his brother and sister-in-law, and they're visiting their nephew Ian, who's living in Framingham. Welcome to Framingham. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you brought Terry with you. Terry is going to speak about the previous links between Framingham and Framingham, and visits back and forth. He's also going to speak some to you about English history and the time in England when Nicholas Stanford made a decision to leave and come to America. I have so many questions about this period, just starting working on this program, and I kept asking questions, and I'm working with Elder Tuttle, Judge Elder Tuttle, my mother-in-law Mary Murphy, who's a professor of English at the Framingham State College, Ray Schwert, Kat Lavin, Ronnie Cronin, retired teachers. And it was so exciting to me that I thought, you know, we really have such amazing people as our members. We should, if people are interested in it, start a study group and begin in England and find out what was really sort of go in depth about what was going on at the time. Terry's going to give us a bit of that, but I'm fascinated by it, and I thought it would be a good idea. And I don't know if you all know the treasures we have and these people who are part of our program and part of our membership, but they really are, and I would encourage you come to me at the end of the program and let me know if you're interested in signing up for such a study group. Because who knows where it could go. I mean, as with these programs, they get a life of their own. So I am going to point you to the program. Terry is going to be speaking about Framingham. We're going to have a film on Framingham. And then Ron Cronin is going to speak about Danforth Farms and Mr. Danforth's land grants that came to establish in Framingham in 1700. And then Judge Tuttle is going to speak briefly about his research into the name Framingham and what happened to the L. Question and answers, if you could hold them to the end of the program, that would be great. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce Terry. Terry is Vice Chairman and Trustee of the Land Museum of Framingham Castle. He reports that their museum receives 70,000 visitors annually. They have a castle, we don't. He's a licensed lay minister at St. Michael's Church in Framingham, where Nicholas Danforth was the church warden in the early 17th century. Terry was a head teacher at the Sir Robert Hitcham Primary School in Framingham from 1977 to 1996, and he's also a member of the Framingham Historical Society. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Terry Gilbert.
Thank you very much, and it's a huge privilege and an honour to be here. This gentleman here, who is one of your honoured citizens of past years, came to Framingham in 1931, the year after this picture, and he was received rapturously, and the newspaper report says that he was completely relaxed and at ease when he delivered his talk, and I hope I should be the same. Just very quickly to go through these slides, this is the history of our link. John Merriam, as I said, obviously a very good big guy in the history of this community, and I probably don't say any more of that. William Brunger came from Framingham to Framingham in 1930 for the tercentenary of Massachusetts Company, the Bay Company. That triggered a visit back when John Merriam came to Framingham the following year, and these were the people who greeted him. There is Mr. Brunger again, and here is John Booth, who you will hear me mention in a moment, probably our most distinguished historian in Framingham of the 20th century, who did a lot of work on this link. Here we are sitting together, and some of the other Framingham worthies who welcomed John Merriam. Constance Brunger came here in 1950. That's the sister of William Brunger, the short fellow, and that is her outside Danforth's farmhouse that we're going to see more of in a moment. And she incidentally lived very little, or we currently live in the house which are very good friends of ours. This is that newspaper report of John Merriam's visit. Mr. John Merriam, moderator of Framingham, Massachusetts, had an immensely enthusiastic welcome on Saturday night when he was present at the 6th and last performance of the great pageant which had been held at Framingham Castle. That pageant still remains one of the great events in the history of our town, well, one of the great events of the 20th century anyway. There are still a few people alive who can remember it. What sadly happened is that we don't have a film, an old-fashioned cine film was made of it, of which there are about 2 minutes in the film archive at East Anglia. The original copy sadly got lost. We heard a rumour that you've got a copy of here.
We looked, but that doesn't mean it might not turn up later.
If it does, please let us have a copy. I'll pass those pictures round so that you can just sort of look at your leisure. Perhaps you might like to read that in full detail. Right. Annie has told you how a bit about me, but and told you how it came about that we were very kindly invited by Ian and his partner to come here, and that was too good an opportunity not to grab. As Annie said, I'm a trustee of the museum, and I was the chairman of the trustees, and I always said through my time that I would come to Framingham to get this link going, but this year it has all come together in this marvellous way. There are one or two little more factors, credentials, which give me a feeling that I ought to be here. The strongest reason I think I feel comfortable to speak about Nigel Nicholas Danforth and this whole story that he set in motion is where we live, in Framingham. Our house, albeit was a new build in the 1970s, sits almost halfway between Nicholas Danforth's New Street farmhouse and the town centre. When we first moved there in 1977, we could look out of the rear windows of our house across the fields and see the farmhouse a half a mile away to our west. From the front of the house, same sort of distance to the east, we see pictures like we've got over there of Framingham as it is today. The land on which our house sits was sold to us by the late Sir Fulcher, whose family at one time lived in Nicholas Danforth's farmhouse. Nicholas Danforth was a churchwarden in Framingham in the early years of the 17th century, and by another coincidence my wife Beryl was a churchwarden in Framingham from 1997 to 2001. And one other little touch was that in 1980 the church produced a Sonny Lumiere story of Framingham, not nearly rivaling that marvellous pageant I was telling you about, but it was good fun. And my youngest son Philip, now grown up, he played the part of Nicholas Danforth's youngest son, who came over here in 1634. Going back to that fellow John Booth, who was sitting in the front row of pictures, he was, I think, as I said, our most notable historian. He researched aspects of the link on more than one occasion. On the 17th of October 1934, a paper written by him was presented at a meeting of this historical society held in the John Maynard Assembly Hall, which I imagine is over there. It was entitled Nicholas Danforth and His Neighbours. An introductory piece to the booklet was written by John Merriam, who acknowledged that it was a distinct compliment to the Framingham Society that John Booth had permitted the first ever reading of his paper to be here in Framingham. The piece of writing was significant for more than one reason. Firstly, it produced background information about Nicholas Danforth in terms of his time and place in English history. This in turn explains to some extent why he should have left England to be a part of establishing the New England. We English visitors to this part of the world are incidentally intrigued, even honoured, are reunited with such a rich collection of English place names when we look at a detailed map, or as we're doing, travel about. We're also a bit confused because they're not in the same place. Cambridge is not to be next to Worcester and so on. But we're flattered that you've looked to the old country. From the English perspective, John Booth's work was good historical research. It looked back to what was life. Can we pause and let people come in?
Come on up front. Elsa, you want to come up front and maybe you can sit up front and people can take their seats in the back?
There are three up here.
Three chairs here. More people up here. There's two seats up here. And there's a chair right there by the machine. Come on up front.
We have two chairs here. Two or three chairs here, so you can get. Yeah.
There's chairs here too, but I don't know where to put them. There's room for someone over here if you want to come around. I know, I guess so.
Okay, shall we go again? Thank you very much for coming. Really, it's lovely to be into Framingham and Framingham get each other going in this way. As I said, John Booth's historical research was good for us in England as well as for you here in Framingham. It looked back to what life was like in the 17th century from the period of the yeoman farmer. Now, I don't know if you're familiar in the USA with that word. It's no longer one which drops easily off of the lips of modern English people, but it was an expression of 400 or 500 years ago. It represented a new rising middle class of country landowner whose influence was challenging and replacing a previous governing class, the so-called gentry or minor aristocrats. One of our historians, Morgan, in 1984, put it this way: the gentleman rented out his lands, wore cloth and linen and read Latin, while the yeoman was a working farmer, wore leather and read and wrote in English. But the yeoman, who had also by definition to be the owner of land worth more than 40 shillings, a property qualification at this time, not much different, I suppose, from the millionaire of today, had another potential. What was significant in English history was that that kind of person was increasingly taking on the role of leadership, government, mainly, though not exclusively, at the local level. They were the church wardens, the local magistrates, and persons who gave their communities leadership. And we know that Nicholas Danforth was a church warden in Framingham not long before he made the enormous life-changing move to Suffolk in England. Merriam and Booth sought to get behind the facts of the story and try and discern what was going on in the mind of this person. We can take another look at the event, but I guess that we shall still conclude and say, who knows? And I would say at this stage, by the way, that insofar as I am qualified to talk as an historian, my conviction is always that history is an act of the interpretation of the facts of any given situation. We have some factual information of this period, including quite hard facts about Nicholas Danforth and his family, one person may put a quite different interpretation on them from another. That is my qualification before I proceed further. But I think that the final explanation for his leaving Framingham and his coming to Framingham was quite simply a Puritanism thing. Alistair McGrath, one of our prominent theologians, has written, although Puritanism was a major theological and political force in early 17th century England, its most significant development took place in the New World. The repressive religious policies of King Charles I forced many Puritans to leave England and settle on the eastern coastal regions of North America. Most of you here will be descendants of Puritans. You can tell me about that challenge itself. So Nicholas's decision was part of the mindset which was powerfully fashionable in the England of his time. I'll attempt to set the scene in England at this time, both nationally and locally, which would have determined how he came to make his decision. You will know that England, indeed what we now know as the British Isles, had embraced the ideas of the Reformation in the previous century. That it was an untidy, even squalid process made possible by Henry VIII because he wanted a divorce is conceded until this day by just about everyone, including church persons who can also see the grander purposes of Almighty God at work as well. Through the subsequent reigns of the kings and queens who followed Henry, we had Reformation and Counter-Reformation forces contending with each other. I think I would confuse you if I tried to outline them in detail. We must have a sort of brief view. The most violent move to undo the national commitment to Protestantism was during the reign of Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter. She was also, as you know, called Bloody Mary, and ruthlessly ordered the execution of the leaders of the English Reformation, including Archbishop Cranmer, Bishops Latimer and Ridley. And interestingly enough, about 6 weeks ago, we were in Oxford at the spot where all that happened. The interesting factor about that for Framingham was that it was in our own castle, dear old Framingham Castle, that Mary was proclaimed Queen. She came there because the Dukes of Norfolk were Roman Catholic, as most branches of the family are to this day. I'll tell you more about that, but let's move on. Elizabeth I, in my view, one of our greatest monarchs, preserved the principles of the Reformation with good balance. James Stuart was brought from Scotland to ensure the continuation of the Protestant succession on the English throne, and it was during his reign that the authorised version of the Bible, much like on your side of the Atlantic as well as ours, was published. James did not see eye to eye with Puritans. He'd come from Scotland, where Presbyterianism, the Presbyterianism form of Protestantism, was strongly the style. And this, among other things, was against episcopacy, that is, bishops, and also against any idea that the monarch had a right to reign over and above the consent of the people. The Stuart kings were very wedded to the idea that there was a divine right of kings or queens to rule. All this outlook Charles I brought to his kingship, as well as a need for money to pursue his ambitions. The Puritan and anti-royalist feeling fought him at first politically in Parliament and then in the Civil War militarily. And as you will know, this ended badly for him, with the powerful Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, ousting him to become the Lord Protector, so for 10 years giving us a Republican government for the only time in our history. But all this was the 76 years after Mary had been crowned in Framlingham Castle. Nicholas Danforth's descendants would have heard all about the Civil War from him, and by then, of course, Nicholas himself was dead. Why had he left England before all these things reached that pass? Well, we must go back to Charles I's reign, for on the ecclesiastical front, he had a notable ally to his interests in the form of William Laud, his Bishop of London from 1628 to 1633, and the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1633 to 1649. Laud did not want to reverse the Reformation back to Roman Catholicism, certainly not as far as giving back control of the English Church to the Pope, but he did want High Church, or even Romish elements, to be restored to the nature of worship and practice in the Church. He was implacably opposed to Puritanism, which he regarded as unsatisfactory in several regards. He approved of bishops and the concept of the priest opposed to the pastor. Puritanism, as we all know, equals simplicity in worship style. Laud wished to bring back colour and ceremonial, as the Reformation had spoken against, and generally succeeded in removing them. If any of you have been to Framingham in Suffolk and have been into St Michael's Church, you will have seen facing you, as you enter the main door, a medieval painting of the Trinity and the Crucifixion. Just one. It is reasonable to suppose that there are others along the wall of the nave. The walls are all lime washed, and this particular piece was rediscovered in 1890 under several coats of plaster. We can imagine that Nicholas Danforth grew up in the period when either this covering took place or when it was authorised. We think it did happen in the Reformation, but it may have been something that happened during the Commonwealth, that is, during Cromwell's reign. But anyway, our church is plain. All that colour isn't there. Archbishop Laud did not succeed in having churches restored to their former bright colour with any English churches. Well, all this heavy stuff I've put before you because we know, we can see how it did impact directly on Framingham and upon Nicholas's decision to emigrate, to come to you. I want now to read through the extract from John Merriam's introductory paper to the book by John Booth that I referred to earlier. I don't know that other than that inaugural reading, when these words might have been read aloud here, but even if it's often, they deserve to be heard this evening in this context. They've not been heard in Framingham these many years, but I can assure you that they will be part of the reporting back that I should give about this on my return. They are a tribute to a person who your community justly held in high esteem, and in my view, they clearly explain why Nicholas Danforth came here. John Merriam wrote, "It is thought that Nicholas Danforth came on the Griffin, which arrived in Boston on September the 18th, 1634. That was a boat of about some 300 tons, and the record is that she brought about 100 passengers and cattle for the plantations. Think of the discomfort and perils of such a trip. A recent writer, Charles Edward Banks, in his Planters of the Commonwealth, which contains a list of the boats sailing across the Atlantic in the decade of the Puritan emigration, 1630-1640, with partial lists of passengers, describes the herding together of passengers and cargo as follows. As far as is known, no one has left a contemporary description of the conditions of Atlantic travellers at this time, and the best that can be done is to reconstruct them by utilising fragmentary references of emigrants to produce a synthetic picture of an average voyage. And he goes on to talk about this in overcrowded decks. It's great. It may be left to speculation how the sanitary needs of the passengers were provided in ordinary weather with smooth seas. The imagination is beggar to know how the requirements of nature were met in prolonged storm in these small boats when men, women and children were kept under the hatches for safety. This may be mentioned as an inevitable accompaniment of emigration at its beginning. Under the best of circumstances, such a voyage was not an inviting prospect for any father with a motherless brood of young children. Nicholas Danforth, remember, brought 6 children. John Joseph May, in his Danforth genealogy, refers very pleasantly to Elizabeth, the wife of Nicholas, who died in Framingham, stating that there was tradition in the family that she was the daughter of William Symes, a minister of Canterbury. If so, she was the sister of the Reverend Zachariah Symes, the long-time minister of Charleston. It's interesting in connection with this to learn from Banks that this minister and his wife and 6 children were passengers on the Griffin, and this fact may naturally have been the potent reason why Danforth came on this particular boat. Other passengers were the Reverend John Lothrop and family, later the minister of Scituate, and William and Anne Hutchinson family. As we read of this religious leader, Anne Hutchinson, who soon proved so disturbing in the New England theocracy that she suffered banishment, we wonder if the weather proved sufficiently tranquil to permit discussion between her and her fellow clerical passengers on the voyage over, or whether or not the layman Danforth joined them. It's also interesting to note that in these 4 families there seem to have been 24 children, 6 Lothrops, 7 Hutchinsons, 5 Simonses and 6 Danforths. In the face of all these deterrents, what was there to induce Nicholas Danforth in 1634 to say in effect, "Nevertheless, God helping me, I propose to cast my lot and the lot of these my children and their children to remote generations with the sturdy folk who under the stress of these times are seeking to establish the new order." The answer to this question is indicated in a beautiful and impressive introductory paragraph found in Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, a most interesting record of the great events of the colonial period as Mather saw them. Now, I guess in this society you know quite a bit about Mather. I had to look him up on the internet, but he was one of your great clergymen and historian too, and a lot of how your history began was well plotted by him. In the second volume of his great work, bearing the title Salgentium, we have a biographical sketch of the Reverend Samuel Danforth, the second son of Nicholas, who became famous as minister, scholar, poet, astronomer, one of the earliest graduates and one of the first fellows of Harvard College, and the progenitor of the illustrious descendants. And, here I feel sort of something in there, because we're talking about a guy born in Framingham in Suffolk. In this paragraph, Cotton Mather says, in this paragraph, Cotton Mather says, referring to Nicholas Danforth, that he was a gentleman of such estate and repute in the world that it cost him a considerable sum to escape the knighthood which King Charles I imposed on all so much per annum, and of such figure and esteem in the church that he produced that famous lecture at Framlingham in Suffolk, where he had a fine manor, which lecture was kept by Mr. Burrows and many other noted ministers in their turns, to whom, and especially to Mr. Shepherd, he proved a guidance, and then especially when the Laudian fury scorched them. Don't worry, I'm going to explain this. This person had 3 sons, whereof the second was our Samuel, born in September in the year 1626, and by the desire of his mother, who died 3 years after his birth, earnestly dedicated them unto the school of the prophets. His father brought him to New England in the year 1634, and at his death, about 4 years after his arrival here, he committed his hopeful son of many cares and prayers unto the paternal oversight of Mr. Shepherd, who proved a kind patron to them. So, you see, this was the thing. His wife had died in England. He bravely came over here, but his children were still in need of care. This Mr. Shepherd takes them on. But now, John Merriam starts to explain these different things. Famous lecture, Mr. Shepherd, Gaius, Lord Inferior. What colour do these words give to the picture we will visualise of Mr. Danforth? In Green's History of England, and also in Samuel E. Morrison's The Builders of the Bay Colony, we have references to the lectures of the Puritan era. William Laud, as Bishop of London, and later as Archbishop of Canterbury, suppressed these lectures insofar as he could. They plainly were, to quote a modern word, propaganda, provided for out of private sources in the interest of the Puritan thought. The man who produced such a lecture must have been an outstanding Puritan leader of his own town, or possibly of a number of nearby towns and villages. I have not yet learned the identity of this Mr. Burrows referred to in this passage. Possibly he was one of the Puritan emigrants, but I have not found his name in this connection and think probably he was a Puritan leader who remained in England. But there can be no doubt as to Mr. Shepherd. He was the Reverend Thomas Shepherd, the pastor described by Morrison as possibly not the most learned of the New English clergymen, but the most loved. In 1634, he was living in retirement in Ipswich, only 15 miles distant from Framingham. He was shipwrecked in his first attempt to leave East Anglia, but a year later, in 1635, he came over with a number of followers in the Defence, the ship The Defence. He was at once welcomed in Newtown, organised a church, succeeding the Reverend Thomas Hooker as he was leading over the Connecticut path to follow the more distant settlement at Hartford. And this Mr. Shepherd therefore became the pastor of Danforth in his new settlement. What was this Laudian fury referred to so vividly by Cotton Mather in his passage? Let me tell you in the words of Thomas Shepherd himself, as we find in his autobiography published from the original manuscript about 100 years ago. I quote his words. This is powerful stuff. December the 16th, 1630, I was inhibited from preaching in the Diocese of London by Dr. Laud, Bishop of that diocese. As soon as I came in the morning, about 8 o'clock, falling into a fit of rage, he asked me what degree I had taken in the university. I answered I was a Master of Arts. He asked me of what college. I answered of Emmanuel. He asked me how long I had lived in his diocese. I answered 3 years and upwards. He asked me who maintained me with all this while, charging me to deal plainly with him, adding withal that he had been much cheated and equivocated by some of my malignant faction, more than ever had been done by a Jesuit. At the speaking of these words, he looked as though blood would have gushed out of his face, and did shake as if he had been haunted with an ague fit, to my apprehension, by reason of his extreme malice and secret venom. I desired him to excuse me. He fell then to threaten me, and with all to bitter railing, calling me all to naught, saying, "You prating coxcomb, do you think all the learning is in your brain?" He pronounced his sentence thus: "I charge you to neither preach, read, marry, bury, or exercise any ministerial functions of any part in my diocese, for if you do and I hear it, I will be on your back and follow you wheresoever you go, in any part of this kingdom, and so effectively disenable. I besought him not to deal with me in that way. You have made a complete and seditious, factious bedrooms, he said. And so it went on. I think, as John Merritt says, we can agree this was a scorching blast. As a licensed minister, I have some sort of ecclesiastical obedience to bishops, but I'm glad to say the bishops that I deal with are on the whole pretty decent fellows. I don't think I cope very well with Archbishop Law. What does Mather mean by saying that Danforth proved a Gaius in this situation, and especially to Mr. Shepherd? The reference in the use of this name Gaius, which had occurred to me as a lawyer, John Merriam's lawyer, was to the famous writer of the Romans, who left his institutes as one of the sources of Roman law. If so, then I thought Mather would have us believe that Danforth, although a layman in some unusual way, was a counsellor to these silenced Puritan clergymen. This seemed appropriate, especially in the case of Mr. Shepherd, when we realise that in 1634-5 he was in hiding in Ipswich, when on his way hither he was only 29 or 30 years old, while Danforth would have been many years his senior. From this point of view, we would see Danforth as the counsellor and guide of Shepherd, and as a strong support in the Puritan settlement of the new town. But, this is in the 1930s, this is reading it, a message has been received from Canon Lanchester, rector of Framingham, who as a clergyman has promptly recognised the connection in which this name was used. This message, which has come to him, is to see Romans chapter 16, verse 23, in which we read the significant words, Gaius mine host. Mather clearly had in mind the man Gaius, thus immortalised in St. Paul's epistle as a gracious host who had befriended him and wished him to be included in the salutation to all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints. In fact, there are two other references in Paul's epistles to Gaius, and I think this is my little bit of an addition to the story, which I don't think I've seen anywhere else. If you read the third epistle of John, tucked right at the end of the New Testament, it's just an 11-verse epistle. It's all about Gaius. Now, whether it was this Gaius, I don't know, but it probably was, because the whole theme of the epistle is about Christian hosting, Christian pastoring. So it seems to have to go. What a happy solution, says Merriam, of this mystifying reference. And what a beautiful tribute to this older Danforth as we recall the days of the trials of the Puritan clergy in Old England. Danforth at once became a leading citizen when he came here. He brought with him all that experience, having made a decision. He was a selectman during the year 1635-6, Deputy General of the Court 1636-7. Appointed one of the commissioners to set the bounds of the new plantation. Both Nicholas and his son Thomas were very skilled at surveying, which is why so much land was bought for Danforth farms. It was a skill that they'd obviously acquired as farms, which Nicholas had in some way passed on to his son. While his name has been obscured by the greater public record made by his sons, Thomas, Samuel and Jonathan, still in these 4 years that he spent with you, well, not in this community, I know, but in New England, he did enough to entitle him to remembrance as a strong man, an influential leader, and undoubtedly a determined Puritan.
Excuse me, sir. Would it be possible for you to speak a bit louder for us, the latecomers, but we can't hear too well?
Do you want to come? There's a seat here. Come on.
Well, there's more than one person. There's quite a few of us back here, so if you could just speak up a little louder, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
That piece that I just read states explicitly that Nicholas was by no means alone in his enterprise in coming here. And beyond those mentioned, we need to think of John Winthrop, who came from just the other side of our county of Suffolk. Bartholomew Gosnold, right, he was more an explorer who came to New England, Martha's Vineyard, a bit earlier, 1602, but he just lives down the road from us in Framingham. The Morse family from Ipswich, who intermarried with the Danforths. You know, we've sent half our county to you. I think I can read the mind of Nicholas a little, for I think of that farmer who sold us the land for our house nearly 30 years ago. He was also a churchwarden in Framingham in years gone by. He had a simple faith, which was very Puritan in character. He was somewhat conservative in his thinking, but willing to embrace new ideas if he was given time to consider them. Many Suffolk folk, especially farmers, are like him. What, however, is more remarkable about them in relation to this story is that they travel very little, and with some reluctance. Suffolk is good enough for them. I cannot think that Nicholas left without a great sense of relish. But he did. The rest, as they say, in the words of a rather overworked cliche, in our country anyway, the rest was history. But it was your history. And the story of the Danforths in America is a very admirable one. The story of the word Danforth in Framingham is that a small housing complex is so named, and we pass it every time we go into our town centre. When we first came to Framingham, those houses were inhabited by American service personnel serving at the Air Force Base 8 miles away at Bentwaters. That was closed as part of the peace deal. It was very appropriate that that link existed. Well, what I said so far is what I really wanted to say. It's well less than 100 years since the exchanges between our communities began to be celebrated so clearly, as far as we know. But even they have become forgotten about and mean nothing, even to the persons I taught in Framingham a quarter of a century ago. Individuals who are now prominent in the running of our community as it is today. We must ensure that these links, and particularly that they are noted when, with new significance, when special dates in the calendar come along. There are all sorts of things I could venture into. I mean, the history of Framingham, well, we can't do that. There's an awful lot of it, so we just won't. But we want just something about this area. Now, I know that the judge is going to deal with this, but let me tell you one story, explanation about it. I mean, we have in Framingham various spellings, and the judge is going to tell you some others. You'll hear Framingham, Framingham, Framlingham, and Framingham is possible to do with the lazy way of speaking that we have in East Anglia. Or as one wit has put it, East Anglians don't like to open their mouths too wide in case the east wind coming across it. And we all customarily shorten it to Fran anyway. In a moment I'm going to present to Annie some copies of our historical journal called Fran. Our family website is Gilda Fran. So that, but this is a nice little one which the judge won't have when we tell you. Perhaps the best explanation of where the name came from, as far as Framingham is concerned, you know, whatever happened to the L, is, oh yes, I'll just quickly show you that. That is the copies we have of the transfer of land between Thomas Danforth and somebody called Corrick buying his farm land. Most of the land, I think the biggest section, was bought from Unions. But that's a copy of the deed that we have in the Museum of Framingham. But I want to go on to this. There's Framlingham. Now, where did you get a spelling like that? Well, it possibly goes back to the Anglo-Saxon. The Anglo-Saxon word, remember, before you had your emigration, before we had all the emigration that are getting the world in the tip today, in the mud of the day, we were part of the emigration from Northern Europe, Anglo-Saxon peoples, Vikings and so on. The Anglo-Saxons had come to Framingham and no doubt found it a very cosy place to be. A lovely meal, a stream running through it, a good place to be. And they settled and got comfortable. And then up the river came these warring Vikings. Our river was very narrow. We believe it was navigable and the way they got in. So the Anglo-Saxon people would have been pushed out by these fearsome warriors. They would have looked back to their hand, their home, as the place of strangers. Framingham, the place of strangers. So that's one of the explanations we need at the moment. Just that trace of history about it, but good enough. For us to do. Thank you very much for listening. There's more. In fact, we're going to move now to a little film which was made by a very good friend of mine, Desmond Clifton, which I think will give even more of a flavour of what I'm saying.
Monday the 10th of July 2006, and here we are standing in glorious weather on the top of Framlingham Church, and we're looking westwards across the town of Framingham, and indeed the house that you could see on the horizon, the last house in the direction we're facing, is indeed the home of, or was the home of, Nicholas Danforth before he left these shores in 1634. The Framingham he left is very different from what it was then, has developed considerably, and only pieces adjacent to this church would be recognisable to him. Even those who made the journeys in the 1930s and the 1950s in connection with our link would find differences. But then again, there are certain things that go well back. Framingham College, across to the northwest, from here, was built in 1850 and is very much a feature of Framingham. And there in the centre of the town is something very close to the age of Danforth himself. He wouldn't have seen it, but it was built only 30 years after he left these shores. It's the Sir Robert Hitcham Almshouses, a lovely piece of 17th century architecture right in the heart of our town, with its gabled roofs and, as we see them from here, the black and white doors. But the rest of Framingham Framingham has developed considerably, and yet it has kept this lovely medieval character. The planners are insistent that where possible, red roofs, tiled roofs are kept, so that this vista, which is Framlingham, is here. A building that Nicholas Danforth would certainly remember is the famous Castle of Framingham, which we are now looking at away to the northeast of the town. The castle was built in 1190 in its present form, and therefore was very much part of the story of Framingham in the time of Nicholas. But its biggest period had come and gone, and indeed only 20 years after he left these shores, they actually pulled down a substantial part of the inside of the castle. So that is something different, but the castle remains very much a feature of our town and an attraction to thousands of visitors, not only from our own country, but from the United States and the world, year by year. Now we've entered the Land Museum Framingham, and I'm going to introduce you to Bob Roberts, who is the chairman of the trustees of the museum. Bob.
Hi, hello, delighted to be able to speak to you about our little museum in Framingham. We are a very well-resourced institution. We operate this museum under a franchise for English heritage, but unfortunately, like so many small museums, we don't have enough space. But we do have a wonderful range of exhibits, and that is what you'll be seeing in this film. We mainly concentrate on the 19th and 20th century. We don't have very much medieval material, I'm afraid, but that's because so little, sadly, has survived from the castle itself. But I do hope you'll find it engaging to see some of the quite nostalgic items that we have. Some of which may even take you back to your own childhoods. Thank you.
Here we are looking at an exhibit which is very relevant to our link, because this is the poster which tells the story of the Framingham pageant of 1931, to which, indeed, people came from Framingham as visitors, and it then triggered off an exchange of visits back to your town. The pageant was a very lavish production for its time, which told the story of Framingham with real-life characters riding on horseback and in fine costume and all sorts of near Hollywood-style production. This is the Flodden Helm, which is a replica of the Flodden Helm because the original is in the church, and that played an important part in the story of the Dukes of Norfolk. link with Framingham. Desmond is the fellow here who's doing the filming, just had coffee in the Crown, our favourite watering place here in Framingham. And this indeed would have been known to Nicholas Danforth, not in its present form, as indeed would not any of the buildings around the square in terms of facade, but the shape of the square, again, is something that Nicholas Danforth would have been aware of, because this is an ancient market square of the kind which gives Framingham its character and its history. So we are looking, in spite of the very modern motor cars, at the front of the market square as it has been here in Framingham for hundreds of years. come now to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Herbie. Their dog was long enough to leave. And this is where they live, but where in the 16th century Nicholas Danforth lived. Behind me is built in 1530, and this side is built in 1580. And it is substantially the building in which Nicholas Danforth lived. Mr. and Mrs. Kirby are now kindly going to take us into their home to have a look at it from the inside.
And shall we go inside now just to show you around the interior part of the old property?
Originally, this was the front door. The stairs would have gone up here, and would have been the only stairs in the house, and would have gone right the way up to the attic. And then over here, there would have been a window, because up there you can see a tiny triangle, which is where the triangular mullions fitted. And I can show you those in more detail over here. This big window wouldn't have been here. There would have been a mullion window here, quite a big one, because there's 5 triangles, and I don't know how low it would have come down. But not too low, because they wouldn't have had glass when they first built it. They'd have just had shutters, wouldn't they?
There's nothing.
It's hard to tell where the windows were in this room, but the one thing that we do know is that they reused, when they built the extension, they reused an old beam because these are outside shutter marks. So the shutter on the outside of the window would have hung here. And as you can see, look, the triangles, diamond shapes are there again. So they've reused this beam from somewhere else.
Now we come upstairs, and Mrs. Kirby will lead us into the room where Nicholas Danforth actually slept. But before we go, she will point out to us the significance of this post, because we're actually looking now at what was the outside wall.
The outside, which would have been lath and plaster, what did you know? No, what would it have been? Cow manure and something. It would have been painted, it would have had something stuck on it, and those would have helped it adhere.
Actually, in the bedroom in which we are sure Nicholas Danforth himself would have slept. These windows, in shape, if not in actual substance, are the windows through which he would have looked. And indeed, as we look past those trees, is the church of Framingham. So that we have a reversal of the picture with which we started our film, looking back at Framingham from the home of Nicholas Danforth.
Sorry for the standing in the back. 7-minute stretch. Kim, do you want to come up and we can present you maybe some new things for the exhibit at your museum? Yep. Thank you for coming, and just have a few trinkets for you from our museum show, you and your museum show. One of these, this is, I'm surprised you haven't seen this, but Steve Herring is our historian. Sadly, we moved to Florida, but this is really, it's very good reading. And there's one for you and one for the museum.
Thanks so very much.
Okay.
I present to you these are copies of our historical journal. The guy that you saw on the film besides myself, Bob Roberts, who took my place as chairman of trustees, is also the editor of this excellent magazine, journal, and it's got every single copy there.
Wow.
Great.
Thank you.
Historical stuff. Also, I'll open mine if you will.
Okay. Oh my goodness, this is beautiful. Wow, the Framlingham plate.
Do we have a select?
We do. Yes, Ginger. Who is related to Mr. John Merriam?
That's a message from the chairman of our town council.
Oh, my. Can you read it? Because I don't have my glasses. John Merriam was my grandfather.
This is from a lady called Stephanie Bennett, who is the chairman of our trustees. If you want it, she looks like, pull up Framingham on the web and the pictures there, that's all it's me. For the Board of Selectmen and residents of Framingham, the members of Framingham Town Council would like to take advantage of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert's visit to send warmest greetings to the people of Framingham. We are pleased to have the opportunity to reaffirm the historical link between our two communities. We send best wishes for the prosperity of Framingham and its citizens and hope that our links will be maintained in the future. With kindest regards from Framingham Town Council, Chairman Stephanie Bennell, Eileen Coe, Town Clerk.
I accept this on behalf of the Selectmen, and I'm honored to meet you, and I am so happy that you were able to come to Framingham. And when I didn't have time to stop at home and get something, but I do have a signature of Thomas Frankfurt on a deed signed by local Indians, and I have another reference to him, but I have a signature of his little scroll. And so the next time you have a gathering, maybe I can bring it to share.
I don't know if you all want to do a seventh inning stretch, but we do have a little bit more. Ronnie Cronin is just going to take us quick show of the land grants and how we got to 1,700 establishment of Framingham. Ronnie is on board, and she is the chair of our education committee. She and Pat Lavin, who is here helping with the refreshments, run a program. We call it the Patterns in History, where every third grader in Framingham comes to this museum, both this building and the other building. Quite a feat. She has a wonderful cadre of docents, and she just does so much for the Historical Society. So thank you, Ronnie.
Before I start my little talk, what I'm after hearing Terry, I just want to tell you about some of the things we have in the room when we are all finished. In the back, down where Mary Murphy is standing, There is pictures. We have a lot of things in our files of that 1931 pageant that was done in Framingham. And so there's a book and some information. The front of your little program, that is the Crown Hotel that Terry, you saw Terry coming out having a little drink. And this is a wooden cut, linoleum cut, and which is in our archives. And so we decided to use that. And on this side, we have a lot of pictures. We have some before pictures taken in the 30s, postcards, and then someone donated pictures that they took in about 87. And I was lucky enough, a long time ago, 39 years ago, that I did go to Framingham. And my little story is when I said to them I was from Framingham, and it was nice to be in Framingham. The man at the castle said, no, not Framingham, it's Framlingham. So if I've been mispronouncing it, I apologize. And tell all the kids that I've taught. So I know Terry has talked about in all of the towns, and I thought this would be something that you would like to see. Framingham is the blue dot. London, about, two of my elbow on the window. Okay. How do I go back? Just the arrow? No, this way, that way. Oh, okay. Okay, I'll stay with you. London is the green dot, so Framingham is about 70 miles north. And the red dot up there is Boston. And the yellow dot is Worcester. And if you look at this closely, I mean, remember New England. And I remember my 5th graders saying, oh, New England. It took them a while, but, and it's interesting. Challenging, excellent. I mean, you just got them all. So that is why I put that one on. So, now, when we look at our town seal, Danforth Farms, there are 2 dates on our town seal. Danforth Farms, 1662, and we have one more date, which I'll tell you at the end. Now, when Terry came in, he said, do you have any streets or anything named after Thomas Danforth? I said, no, because Danforth Street in Saxonville isn't named after Thomas. That's another story. But this man who built houses up for Saxonville Mills. So we look at Danforth Farms, and going back to Danforth's, we have Thomas, son of Nicholas, and this is where we have honored him. And just so, I know you're all bright adults, I have had children say, Mrs. Cronin, that was his house. That's May Hall up at Framingham State. So Thomas Danforth, as far as we know, never came to this area. It was referred to, we think he might have come prior to him buying, having his land when it was called the Wilderness. So this, again, is an older picture of New Street Farms, and we saw Terry up at the window, and my thought is, well, maybe at some point, his dad was thinking of maybe at some point going to the colonies. And seeing the family of Nicholas Danforth, there were 7 children, one of the daughters died, did not make the trip. But for our talk today, our key to it is his son, Thomas, which was the older boy. And being the oldest person at that time was very important because of money. So here we have our boy, Tom, being born in England in 1622. He lives in Framingham for about 12 years and gets on the boat, as Terry said, with his brothers and sisters and comes and settles in Cambridge. In my reading, when the Puritans came into Cambridge, it was called Newtown at the time. They all bought a sizable piece of property, and as we know that, as Terry has said, Nicholas Danforth was a surveyor. He also was very, very interested in getting right into, I would say, politics of the time. And you can see that his dad died 4 years after coming. Nicholas being the oldest son, the children lived together. And as I said, we know that Thomas was a surveyor. And he then, like his dad, got into public service. And he got into public service when he was about 23 years old. And I'm going to look at my notes and give you a little explanation. In Cambridge, he was a selectman for 23 years. Town clerk for 24 years. Then went on to Middlesex County, the treasury reporter. 38 years, very dedicated. Harvard, he was one of the early people behind Harvard, even though he did not go, his brother did. He was 19 years. Then we get into our Mass Bay, the colony. He was representative, which would be like our House of Representatives, for a year, but then an assistant to the General Court, that was sort of like our Senate. And this is where he was when he got his first land grant here. He went on to be a judge of the Superior Court for about 6 years. Then, as we all know, Massachusetts had control, Maine was part of Massachusetts, so he went up there and he was their president of the District of Maine for 9 years. Now, during all this time, committed patriot, was valued and rewarded for his service. In this case, so in 1660, Thomas was granted his first parcel of land in this area for 250 acres. And it was considered, it was in the wilderness between Sudbury and Marlbury. And it said, for helping publish the Puritan Blue Laws. Then, here's our date that we see on our town seal, 1662. He was granted another 250, and the whopper, 14,000. This one has an interesting story. Okay. In May of 1662, he was granted the 250, but then he had some compensation. He spent 10 pounds, British money, for doing some expenses that he was doing. So what happened was, the court said, okay, let's figure out, went to someone from Marlborough, and said, what is this worth, this 10 pounds? So they came back 27 days later or so, and they said, okay, adequate compensation, 10,000 pounds. He gets all of it. So that was about 14,000 acres. He was very. So, this is in beige. I want to tell you, when you're doing it on the computer, it really should be done. So that was his property as of 1662. That's our date on our tax bill. Now, we have proof in 1684, he buys some more land. And on your maps, it says Wade and Russell Farms. And there is a map behind Annie that, and also on the one behind Elsa, that you could see how much this land was. So he picked up and this. And these two men had passed away, and what I have read in, there was a quitclaim deed from the native Indians. And Albert might be able to explain that more than I can. So that's his land ownership. And this is our present board. The dog ponds. So, in Steve Herring's book was a great inspiration, and I go through Temple, there's a lot of books, but you read about him talking about like a utopia. He had plans for his land in his colony, but he was very busy with all of his other things. And before he was able to accomplish this, he passed away, and Framingham then, the year following, we became incorporated as a town. At the time when Thomas Danforth died, and all of that land, the land that he had, there were about 70 families when we became incorporated living in this area. So this is where all in yellow, and again, our present board. And this goes off a little bit more. And that is the one behind the Ginger. Ginger, what? Just not Ginger, I'm sorry, Elsie. Want to pick up that one behind you? I have to give Framlingham's engineering department, they spent 2 mornings with me to create this and figure out how much that really worked on their computers. So at that point, 1699, this was the total acreage. That was Danforth's, and we all know the East name, that was their part of the properties. And here we are today. This is our acreage. And here we are at our incorporated, our second date, June 25th, 1700. I might not be able to tell you what I ate for breakfast, but somehow that date is always stuck in my mind. So that's a little bit of background of the land and Thomas Danforth. I think so many of these talks go on and just study a whole lot. Next, we finally have Albert telling us what happened with that. Let's tell him.
It's been a long program. I want to put this together as briefly as possible. Annie, once you got a hold of me, asked me to do some research to find out why the L disappeared from Framlingham to the town named Framingham. I started out with a dictionary of English place names, and this was prepared by a fellow by the name of A.D. Mills. And in it, he lists Framingham, and it's a homestead of the family or followers of a man called Framingham. Sounds logical. Mr. Gilder's comments about the name from the Germanic people and so forth I found in a couple of histories. However, most of the writers that I have been able to find subscribe to Mr. Mills's idea that the fellow's name was Framla. And in ancient Anglo-Saxon, the suffix ham stands for homestead or home or that type of thing. And in the middle, the ing in Old English is a suffix. It's a place name or stream characterized by a place belonging to. So essentially, if you look at Framingham, it's a hamlet belonging to a fellow by the name of Framlingham. That's what Mills says. There is, however, a history that was prepared by a gentleman by the name of Green in the latter part of the 18th century that outlines the the items that Mr. Gilder mentioned as to the derivation of the name. The first indication that I could find in the derivation of the name is in the Doomsday Book. In case any of you don't know what the Doomsday Book is, in 1066, William of Normandy came across the English Channel, he conquered England, became known as William I or William the Conqueror. In 1085, he had a census done of all the land holdings in England, and it's reproduced in these huge volumes, originally written in Latin. There is an English translation. I have a paperback copy of the English translation. And thoughtfully, somebody did an index in English. And I find that there were grants in Framingham in Suffolk County, England. Now, in the counties, when you saw the map of England, and one of the things that Mr. Gilder says that the towns and counties aren't in the right place. Norfolk is a corruption of Norfolk, and Suffolk is a corruption of Southfolk. And in England, in Anglican, Norfolk is in the north and Suffolk is in the south. In Massachusetts, Suffolk is in the north. So when Mr. Gilder talks about this, that's the reason for his comments. But at any rate, in the census done for William the Conqueror, Framingham in Suffolk County, which is where Framlingham is located, has a number of different names. Framlingham, Franchlingham, Framlingham, Franchingham, and Framlingham. Those are all listed, and there were various grants. The initial grant that I can find, or the initial record, went to a fellow by the name of Roger Edgell, who I think is, Mr. Gilder tells me, is the fellow that built the castle, either that or his progeny constructed the castle. Interestingly enough, there is a Framingham Edgell located in Norfolk County to the north, and there are references in the Doomsday Book to grants to the Earl of Edgell in the north. So there is a Framingham in England. It's a community, and Mr. Gilder tells me there's a Framingham Edgell and a Framingham Earl, both in Norfolk County. So the name as it appears in our town, the Framingham, also appears in England. Now, I researched the colonial records, and thankfully, somebody in 1854 by the name of Shirtliff, at the request of the legislature, prepared a record of the Massachusetts Bay Company in 6 volumes. And there are a couple of compendiums of these kicking around. I found one in the Athenaeum and one in the State Library. The one in the State Library wasn't produced until around 1894, which is 50 years earlier than the first one. The first reference that I could find in those colonial records was to Framingham, occurred in 1674. In 1674, King Philip's War was going on, and the colony imposed a tax on the various communities in order to conduct the war. And there was a tax on Framingham for the sum of £1. And interestingly enough, in that levying of the tax, they spell Framingham as F-R-E-M-I-N-G-H-A-M, which is kind of interesting. However, they murdered a few other names. They spelled Medford, M-E-A-D-F-O-R-D. They spelled Malden, M-A-U-L-D. They spelled Marlborough, M-A-R-L-B-O-R-O-W. They spelled Woburn, W-O-O-B-O-R-N-E. Now, I don't know whether these changes are as a result of the compilation done by Shirtliff, or whether they were the actual things that were written in the documents. You'd have to dig these documents out and let them know. I obtained a copy of the quitclaim deed from the Middlesex South District Registry of Deeds that Ronnie referred to, of the Indian conveyance by quitclaim deed to Thomas Danforth. And that is practically illegible. And you also have got to remember, when you read these documents, for example, that quitclaim deed, that is a transcription by the recorder of the original instrument. The original instrument went back to the owner, and the transcription is in the book and in the records of Middlesex South District Registry of Deeds, and I got a copy of that for the Historical Society, and it is mentioned in Temple's book. I also checked Steve Herring's book. I checked William Barry, who wrote a history of Framingham in 1847, and I checked on Temple, who wrote a history in the late 1880s. And Barry and Temple both mentioned that there was a reference to Mr. Danforth's farm and Framlingham in some birth records, which were recorded in the Middlesex County records, which I was unable to find. And that's the only record. And Temple concludes that the L was dropped out of Framingham as a result of people not being able to spell. You laugh at this, but you have to remember that English is a phonetic language, and it is a language in the turn of the year 1700. Rather, when 1600 arrived, it was a language that didn't even have any dictionaries. There were only about 5 million people in the world that spoke English. It was a minor language. It was considered to be a guttural language. The aristocracy spoke either Latin or French. All of the things that were done by the English kings were done in either Norman French or Latin. And English, people who wrote English all the way up to the time that Samuel Johnson did his dictionary in 1755. Sometimes you'll read a letter from somebody who's very well educated. He'll spell the same word will be spelled in 2 different ways in the letter. So this is not an uncommon thing in the English language. So with all of that, to be very brief, I have concluded that I agree with Temple that it was just a matter of misspelling and dropping the L, and that's how we arrived at the point we're at.
Thank you for being a patient audience, and I'm sorry, maybe you guys want to come in and sit, you guys want to stand up. Go and see our exhibit, which is still up, Fabric of Framingham. We can move some chairs away, but I would encourage some people to go back here so we have room to. And Ginger actually went home and got it.
And I wonder if this is resembles what you saw.
I got a copy of it.
Yeah, I got it. Right.
Okay, this is signed by the local Indians, and this is Thomas Vander's signature here.
Okay, the one I got is out of the Registry of Deeds, and it's something you transcribe as well. It's not. I think it's the original. It has the actual seals.
Okay, and this is another one where it mentions before Danforth, but not a signature.
Yeah, the other question that got asked of me is, what is a quitclaim deed? In legal terms, a quitclaim deed is nothing more than saying, I give you whatever I got. As opposed to a warranty deed. A warranty deed is where the grantor is warranting that he'll defend the property and he has certain rights. But a quitclaim deed, he's just giving you whatever rights he has. Don't take that as a legal opinion.
So, question, because the program's gone over, hopefully if you have questions of Terry or Albert or Ronnie, you can find them in the crowd, and I appreciate it. Enjoy our refreshments, and have a great week. Thank you.